So some of you have been curious about why we're filming this. I'm director of the Principal Center for Global Citizenship, and we do lots of events. And over time, what we've learned is that people often ask, you know, do you film the talks that we sponsor, because people would like to see them online. So we now have created a Drake International YouTube channel, and we don't film all of our events, but we do film many of our events, and then we put them up. We put the videos up on our YouTube channel, and that way community members can find them, our faculty can use them in class, and etc. So we thought that why not go ahead and do the same thing with these. So the first one is already up on our YouTube channel, and the second one is, two of them are up now. We had the second one up originally, and then you remember the little footage we showed of the Olympics? It turns out that, like, as soon as we got it up, some computer algorithm had detected that we had copyrighted material and had blocked our videos. So we had to delete that and then put it back up. So yeah.
David, can we go to your name for YouTube, or how do we find it?
I think John or Paul or Teresa or someone was planning to send you guys the links.
Yeah, it's on.
Yeah, so you'll get access that way. Thank you. Well, Trump keeps making this more interesting for us. Some new developments over the weekend, which I'm going to hold off talking about until we get to a little later, because it fits perfectly in our discussion about Taiwan. Today we are going to focus on two kind of hotspots. You know, there has to be some complication, some issue that that might trigger conflict, and there are a number of them. We're going to talk about Taiwan and South China Sea today as two areas where the U.S. and China have conflicting interests, and where militaries of both countries are, you know, they do exercises, they plan with the eventuality of warfare. But that's not the only two. There's some islands in the East China Sea that are claimed by both Japan and China, and were recently the subject of major conflict between those two countries. And one of the questions that arose was, well, these two tiny, these tiny islands far away from Japan, actually, in the middle of the ocean, they're uninhabited. Do they fall under the U.S.-Japan defense treaty? So if China were to attack those, try to take those islands, and there would be some kind of, would that invoke the treaty? Would the U.S. have to go to war with China to defend these tiny little islands? And the answer was yes. So this actually is an important point about the defense commitments that the United States makes to other countries. And that is that you can get a tail wagging the dog phenomenon, where other countries may feel emboldened by the fact that they feel like, well, we're good because we have the U.S. behind us. Therefore, we can act more provocatively than we would otherwise if we were on our own. And because we've got this guardian angel. And sometimes countries might act too provocatively because of that sense of strength, and end up pulling the U.S. into a conflict that we have no real interest in. The historical example of this that is often cited is World War I. It was a conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia over very local issues. And yet, because they each had great power, alliances, it ended up dragging the other countries into the conflict over which the original issues, they had no real interest in. So that's that is one concern that we have to be worried about. The other major issue, which we won't discuss, is North Korea. And mainly the issue there is whether, if North Korea were to provoke war with the U.S., or if North Korea were to collapse, then how would the U.S. and China see their interests and how they behave? And that's very unclear. So there are a number of hot spots, but we're going to focus on these two, which I think are the ones where there could be the greatest potential for conflict. We're going to start with Taiwan, and let me just work through a timeline here. We won't hit on all these points, but as you know, Taiwan's an island off the coast of China, and it was inhabited by a combination of Aboriginal peoples, basically Pacific Island type peoples, and Chinese who had immigrated from the mainland. But it was basically they didn't have any stable, lasting government. There were Aboriginal tribal groups. There were actually the Dutch, kind of controlled it for a while. But finally, it came under. It was annexed under the Qing dynasty in 1683 and ruled by China up until 1895, when the first Sino-Japanese War, the Chinese lost, and one of Japan's demands was to take control of Taiwan. So actually, between 1895 and 1945, 50-year period, Taiwan was ruled by Japan. Then, in 1945, at the end of World War II, Taiwan returned to Chinese control. And then in 1949, at the end of the Civil War between the Kuomintang, which is basically the nationalist party, some of you may remember Chiang Kai-shek, and he was the general who led the Kuomintang party and the government. He was overthrown on the mainland, but the Kuomintang, the officials in the army, relocated to Taiwan in 1949. And since then, Taiwan has been ruled by either the Kuomintang or an opposition party called the Democratic Progressive Party. Now, one thing that's interesting is that then, since 1895, Beijing, or the mainland, has only governed Taiwan for about 4 or 5 years. That brief period between the end of World War II and the end of the Chinese Civil War, Taiwan was actually ruled from the mainland. But outside of that, it's either been ruled by Japan or it's been semi-independent, de facto independent. Now, the Kuomintang and Chiang Kai-shek, they basically said, we are the legitimate rulers of all China. We happen only to have de facto control over Taiwan at present, but we were and still are the legitimate rulers of China, and we have been unjustly, the communists gained power through violence and illegitimate means, and we look forward to the day when the Kuomintang will once again rule all China. Yeah.
I worked for a guy once who was Chinese, and he left Taiwan. He was Taiwanese, and he left Taiwan, his whole family, and I would say about 1949, because he would be about my age. And then they fled to Brazil, and he grew up in Brazil. And then I worked for him here. He was a brilliant guy. Why would he have left? What would be?
Well, actually, I'm not sure why he would have left, but I will say that under Chiang Kai-shek, the Kuomintang were just as, well, not just as, how do you compare these things, but they were quite authoritarian up until basically the 1980s started a process that led to democratization, right? But before then, and as long as he lived, Chiang Kai-shek was quite authoritarian and quite repressive. They had a secret police, they jailed political opponents, and there was the mainlanders that came over in '49 with Chiang Kai-shek. They were resented by those who had been there all along, who again were a combination of Aboriginal Taiwanese and Chinese immigrants whose families had come decades and sometimes centuries before. And so they viewed the Chinese who came over in '49 as usurpers, as basically carpetbaggers, or they were people who just came over and just took over. And the now the other thing is that so the people who came over with Chiang Kai-shek at the Kuomintang in 1949, they had ruled all of China, and they felt entitled to rule all of China. And they never were settled on the idea of, okay, we're going to have an independent Taiwan. They always looked forward to someday when the communists would fall and there would be an opportunity and they would be able to regain, their place, their rightful place, governing all of China. Now, the Taiwanese who lived in Taiwan long before 1949, their connections to the mainland, yeah, a long time ago, I had an ancestor who came over from Fujian, but, we're Taiwanese. We don't necessarily feel that connected to China. We don't have any, this deep longing to govern it or take over it. So there's always this tension, actually. The more those who came over in '49, I think they were about 15% of the population, but they governed all the businesses and government. They controlled everything. They were resented by the other 85%. And so the more you democratize Taiwan, the more you're giving say in the form of the vote to people who don't have a strong sense of connection to China and who are much more, attracted by the idea of independence. Plus, now, as time has gone on, the descendants of those, even those who came over in '49, they've died off, and their children and grandchildren, their sense of connection to that cause is weakened. So one of the interesting things is that Taiwan has not really been governed directly from the mainland for a very long time. Now, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, the U.S. recognized the government in Taiwan as the government of all China. We did not diplomatically recognize the communist government in Beijing, and most Western countries followed the American lead. So here was a country, the largest country in the world by population, that was just reacted as though it didn't exist, or that it had a government on this small island that in fact didn't have any, whose control was limited to that island. In 1971, the UN decided to shift recognition. So they said, instead of recognizing Taiwan as the legitimate government of all China, we're going to recognize the government of Beijing. And so China's seat on the Security Council and the General Assembly was shifted from Taipei to Beijing. A year later, Nixon visited China. He started a process of normalization of relations, which in 1979 led to U.S. diplomatic recognition of China, which also meant we removed recognition of Taiwan, because China would not go along with the idea of the U.S. recognizing both governments. And in fact, Taiwan didn't want that either. You had to right? And so the U.S. shifted recognition to Beijing. We'll come back a little bit later to what were the terms and how did the U.S. understand its relationship with Taiwan. In 1996, the first free elections were held in Taiwan, and this was after a decade or so of gradual movement toward democracy led by actually Chiang Kai-shek's son. But in 96, there were the first free elections, and the Kuomintang leader, Lee Teng-hui, won. And during the campaign, he had said things that China didn't like about, Taiwan. And so China, really didn't like the idea of democratic elections in the first place. They liked dealing with a fellow authoritarian leader, another, to the extent they had relations at all. But China actually lobbed missiles near Taiwan. It didn't hit anything, but in the seas near Taiwan, they lobbed missiles, and were trying to intimidate the Taiwanese. And they thought that they would scare the Taiwanese to vote, in a certain way, or they would scare the leadership to change some of the things they were saying. And the U.S. sent 2 aircraft carriers to the region. And I was there shortly after this happened, and the Chinese were not very happy about that. They view this as an internal matter. Between the issue between China and Taiwan, totally internal. That's a domestic matter. It's as if the Confederacy had relocated to Key West, and after they lost the war, they were still holding out there. And no question that belongs to the U.S., but we don't happen to be able to control it at the moment. But any other country that sticks its nose in it and sends weapons to Key West and to the Confederacy, would be not welcome. Yeah.
Weren't there other hostilities between the mainland and Taiwan before the mainland too?
Yeah, the 50s. Yeah. There was actually, during the Korean War, while the Chinese were up fighting the Americans in Korea, Chiang Kai-shek saw it as his opportunity to invade China. And do you remember this guy, Douglas MacArthur? He was kind of a Donald Trump character, but in a military uniform, and he actually supported the idea of, let's unleash Chiang to, invade across this Taiwan Straits into China and take it back over to Beijing, and let's keep our military just going into China, and we'll just overthrow the communists. But cooler heads prevailed, and the U.S. actually put an aircraft carrier between Taiwan and China to deter Chiang Kai-shek from sending forces across the strait. So actually, that was we tried to deter China from invading Taiwan, but we also tried to restrain Taiwan from invading the mainland. But there were times when China tried to shell some islands off of Taiwan near the coast, and the U.S. intervened there, and there was some, in the late 50s, there were some tense moments of potential military conflict. Yeah.
When and why and by whom was the name changed from Formosa to Taiwan?
You stumped me. I don't actually know the answer to that. Was it?
What was the question?
When did the name change from Formosa to Taiwan? And that's something I don't know the answer to that. I'll try to find out and get back to you. So coming back to our timeline a little bit, In 2000, the Democratic Progressive Party presidential candidate won. And then the following year, they won a majority in the parliament. And this guy's name was Chen Shui-bian. Democratic Progressive Party was the, mostly was the native Taiwanese. The Kuomintang Party was rooted in the Chinese that came over from the mainland. The Democratic Progressive Party had its, strength among the native Taiwanese, and again represented a much more pro-independence position than the Kuomintang. So this made Beijing very nervous, and Chen Shui-bian during his 8 years as president, he really crept right up to the precipice of declaring formally Taiwan to be independent. Now you might think this is sort of silly because in point of fact, Taiwan is independent. It runs its own affairs. It's influenced by the mainland because there are connections between them, and most countries, only a few countries now actually give diplomatic recognition to Taiwan. Beijing certainly puts constraints on Taiwanese independence. But in point of fact, they don't control Taiwan. And they haven't, as we've said, it's a few years except since 1895. But the crucial point is they don't want Taiwan to declare that it is a separate independent country distinct from China. And we'll come back to an agreement that was made in 1991, which was kind of compromised, but that they could both live with temporarily. But the Chen Shui-bian came very close, and in fact in 2004, he put up for a vote, just like Brexit. He put up a referendum that Taiwanese people could vote on 2 pro-independence measures. And Beijing was, again, really angry there. What happened is that they both passed, they both got a majority of the votes that were cast, but there was an additional provision that they wouldn't be binding unless their turnout was more than 50%. Since turnout fell below 50%, then even though the majority, it wasn't a binding vote. So we don't know if it had been over 50%, would there have been war? I don't know. In 2005, in response to that referendum, China passed the anti-succession law, which basically said explicitly that China will attack should Taiwan declare independence. China had always maintained that it had the right to use military force if necessary to ensure its territorial integrity. The U.S. often pressed China to make a declaration that it would seek unification, yes, but only through peaceful means. And China's never been willing to make that kind of statement. Now, in point of fact, they've always, with a few exceptions like the 50s when they shelled those islands, they've generally held back from using military force, but they've said that we have a legal right to do so. What they said here is, here's the circumstance under which we definitely will use military force. And it's a legal requirement. The government is now legally required to use force if Taiwan declares independence. It was a way of trying to again, deter Taiwan from moving further in that direction.
I presume that's the reason why we've been selling military aircraft to Formosa or Taiwan for many years and just commercial aircraft to China.
Right. We stopped selling. We actually did for a while in the 80s sell military equipment to China. And it was because they were on our side in the Cold War with the Soviet Union. And so we sold military, and after '89, when the Tiananmen Square massacre took place, then we stopped. And we haven't sold since. And we try to get our European allies not to sell military equipment. But we'll come back to the military sales to Taiwan. That's a huge issue for the mainland, and they just can't stand that. 2008, actually, Chen Shui-bian eventually became, after he left office, he was actually put on trial and convicted of corruption and put in jail. He was replaced by a Kuomintang leader, Ma Ying-jeou, who was elected in 2008. He resumed formal talks with the mainland. These talks, by the way, are under the auspices of party talks, since Beijing doesn't want to admit that there's a separate independent government, right? But it can have talks between the Communist Party and the Kuomintang Party. You see what I mean? It's party-to-party talks, not government-to-government. Which is one problem with the Democratic Progressive Party. You know, they couldn't have direct talks because Beijing doesn't recognize them as a legitimate political actor, whereas it does Kuomintang. During these 8 years that Ma was in power, there were a lot of agreements passed between the mainland and Taiwan to increase, especially commercial ties, and also cultural ties, educational ties. There are a lot of mainland Chinese studying in Taiwan now. Direct flights going back and forth. Economically, there's a lot of Taiwanese investment in China, a lot of cross-strait trade goes on. It's really blossomed. However, that led people to worry that the more Taiwan becomes dependent on the Chinese economically, the more China would have leverage over Taiwan. And it's the young people who are most, favorable to independence. And so when Ma carried out an initiative to basically an agreement on trade and services that people said was not properly passed through the legislature. The parliament didn't have sufficient input. Then there was something called the Sunflower Movement, mostly young people who occupied the parliament building for I don't know how long, but for quite a while in a protest. And that was interesting because it was around the time that the umbrella movement was going on in Hong Kong. And so you had young people in both territories kind of pushing each other in directions of challenging their elders' arrangements with Beijing. And then in 2016, the DPP candidate won the presidency again, Tsai Ing-wen, who's a female candidate. And that's where we are now. So she won in January, took office in May. And Beijing is not happy about that. Now, the 1992 consensus, there were party-to-party talks, and the basic framework that they both agreed on, they agreed that there's one China. There's no two Chinas. There's only one China. There's also no one China, one Taiwan. That was outlawed. That was also, they agreed that was not the case. There's only one China. Taiwan is part of that one China. And where they agreed to disagree is that they said we'll have different interpretations on, who is the legitimate government of that one China. Right? In Taiwan, they say it's the Kuomintang, and mainland they say it's the Communist Party. So, but what that meant is that both sides agreed there's only one China, there's no independent Taiwan, right? There's no second China. Now, what's happened recently is that the DPP president, Tsai Ing-wen, has refused to endorse the 1992 agreement. And that means that implicitly she is challenging the idea that there's one China. And some of her, in her party will go even further and are much more, want an even stronger stance. They want to just declare outright that Taiwan is an independent state called Taiwan. There's one China and one Taiwan. There's two independent states, and they can engage in state-to-state negotiations, not party-to-party, but Taiwan is independent. And as we said, China would consider a statement like that grounds for war. Now, what about the U.S. Position? The U.S. has stated that in 1979, there was a joint communique at the time that the U.S. shifted diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to Beijing. And this was part of it. The United States acknowledges the Chinese position that there is but one China and Taiwan is part of China. We acknowledge that position. It doesn't actually say that we agree with it. It says we acknowledge it. This is called diplomatic ambiguity. So this has been the source of a great deal of confusion since then. Now, adding to the confusion, the Chinese thought that the U.S. had agreed that we would sell, they thought we had agreed is that we would sell defensive arms only to Taiwan for a short period of time, after which these arms sales would be phased out. Also, that we would move our troops off Taiwan, and that we abrogated the U.S. Taiwanese defense agreement. We had a formal defense treaty with Taiwan. But look what happens. This was the idea of cutting ties with Taiwan in favor of Beijing. That was never popular among, especially a group of right-wing Republicans in the Congress. So, but it wasn't just, let me be fair about that, it wasn't just Republicans, otherwise it wouldn't have passed, but in 1979 the Congress said, you know what, we're not going to let that joint communique stand as a statement. We're going to pass a resolution which states that any effort to determine the future of Taiwan by other than peaceful means is considered a grave concern to the United States. That the U.S. would provide Taiwan with arms of defensive character, and that the U.S. would maintain the capacity to resist any force, any other forms of coercion that would jeopardize the security of the social economic system of the people on Taiwan. So even though we didn't recognize Taiwan diplomatically, even though we had abrogated the defense treaty with Taiwan, we had signed this joint communication, the Congress made things even more ambiguous by seemingly committing the U.S. to Taiwan's defense through other means. And then in 1982, Ronald Reagan, this was not a congressional, this wasn't ever passed in Congress, this was kind of a declaration issued after the U.S. Consultations with Taiwanese authorities, and you can see said that the U.S. would not set a date for termination of arms sales, that the U.S. would not alter the terms of the Taiwan Relations Act. That was what we just looked at. The U.S. would not consult with China in advance of making arms sales to Taiwan. The U.S. would not mediate between Taiwan and China. That's an important one, because that means that the U.S. will not essentially try to broker a resolution of this conflict. What's interesting here is that it's not mainland China that is saying, well, they say it as well. They don't want the United States to interfere, but it's also Taiwan that says, because Taiwan worries that the U.S. will actually pressure Taiwan to make the concessions that would lead to its loss of independence. The U.S. would not alter its position about the sovereignty of Taiwan, which is that the question should be decided peacefully by the Chinese themselves. Would not pressure Taiwan. And the U.S. would not formally recognize Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan. Remember, we said we acknowledge that the Chinese position is one China. We didn't say that we formally recognize Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan. We still haven't done that. So the Chinese feel like they made a deal with the U.S. in '79, and then the U.S. took most of the substance of that deal and just, reneged on it through these two, the Taiwan Relations Act and this declaration. By the way, in terms of what is China's vision of what the future would look like, basically what they have put on the table what they are offering Taiwan. They're saying if Taiwan were to come back home, to agree to and acknowledge voluntarily that they are under Beijing sovereignty. They are part of China. They give up the idea and the fact of independence. What would they offer? They would basically offer Taiwan similar terms to those that Hong Kong has, except stronger, in the sense that the president of Taiwan would now actually be something akin to a governor of a province, and would also have the title of vice president in Beijing. So they'd actually have the governor of Taiwan would be considered a vice president as well as a governor. And that Taiwan would have, could keep its own parliament, but would also have representation in the National People's Congress, just like other provinces. There are other ways in which the offer on table is more generous. For instance, they said that China would not move military forces onto the island, and that Taiwan could keep its present military forces, but they would be, ultimately under the command of the mainland military. So what Beijing is not suggesting is a wholesale takeover where they would impose their own communist system and they would do away with, Taiwan would still have elections and choose its local leadership, and its laws would still be different, and Taiwan, of course, doesn't want concede any control to China, and they don't trust China. Just like right now, Hong Kong people are saying, well, we feel like we have reason not to trust that China's kept all its promises to us. Someone mentioned arms sales. The U.S. has sold $49 billion in arms to Taiwan since 1979. In 2015 was the latest sale of $1.8 billion. The majority of Taiwanese arms imports are from the U.S. We say they're defensive arms. There's no way to say that. An F-16 is only capable of defending, but not attacking. That's not most weapons you can defend or attack. Now, here's a really important point: is that what makes there are two trend lines that are worrying. On the one hand, the military balance over time is shifting in Beijing's favor. And when it gets strong enough, Beijing will become more bolder about asserting its, trying to pressure Taiwan. On the other hand, Taiwanese identity is becoming more and more distinct from the mainland. You can see here that if you ask people to identify one of three ways, either are you Taiwanese, are you Chinese, or are you both? And you can see here the number in the mid-90s, you know, looks like about maybe, what, 25% said we're Chinese. Now that's very, very low. It's like maybe 5%. You can see the number to say both has risen, has stayed about stable at around 45%. But look at the number to say identify as Taiwanese. To identify as Taiwanese means not only rejecting the idea of being Chinese alone, but it also means rejecting this mixed label of I'm Taiwanese and I'm Chinese. Instead, they just want to be considered Taiwanese as distinct from Chinese.
What's the dominant dialect in Taiwan?
I think it's Fujian, it's the dialect of Chinese. And they use the old traditional lettering too, characters. The more the mainland uses a simplified character set. And so they actually have different characters, and they also use the vertical writing instead of this. Actually, it's really interesting. In the 50s, Mao Zedong was, there's a Romanized version of Chinese called Pinyin. And there were, previous to that, there were other systems with different names, but, where you render the sound of words in their phonetic, equivalent of using our alphabet. And actually, Mao Zedong was seriously considering abandoning the whole ideographic Chinese character system and just Romanizing. He considered, the Chinese system is very difficult to learn, and it was a barrier to mass literacy. And so he was trying to figure out how do we, ensure hundreds of millions of people gain literacy in a short period of time when, there's like 5,000 characters. There's more than that, but that's it. And he said, well, he ultimately decided, we'll simplify the characters to make them easier to write and to read and understand. And as opposed to Romanizing. But in fact, Chinese have to learn. They learn the characters and they learn opinion. And then, of course, the characters are not phonetically connected to the spoken language. So there's really, it's almost like 3 different languages that have to learn. And in Hong Kong, it's even more complex because in Hong Kong, their serious aspiration is that, and they come pretty close, is that every college graduate should be biliterate and trilingual, which means they can read in both in Chinese and English, and they can speak English, Mandarin, and Cantonese. And of course, there's also the opinion and so. And we can't even get our kids to learn Spanish. So Taiwanese views on independence, 65% would prefer the status quo, this kind of ambiguous position that they're in. But if forced to choose between, formally declaring independence or rejoining the mainland, reunification, 69% prefer independence, 17% reunification. Now, Xi Jinping has recently said this: from the position of Chinese people's nationalism, 1.3 billion people on the mainland do not agree to Taiwan's formal independence. The Communist Party will be overthrown by the people if the pro-independence issue was not dealt with. So he's saying that if Taiwan were to declare independence and the government were to do nothing effective to stop it, that the party would be overthrown. Now, you're not, you know, it's, I don't advise that you, when you go to China, that you, if you have strong feelings in favor of Taiwanese independence, I don't advise you to go there to start advertising that. If you know someone, you can have private conversations about this issue. I've never met anyone who had any sympathy with the idea of Taiwanese independence. Taiwan is, in that perspective, it belongs to China. And its loss was a legacy of the external colonial pressures placed upon China during the century of humiliation. In this case, the Japanese and later the American sponsorship of Kuomintang in Taiwan. And that it's an injustice, it's a historical anomaly that needs to be corrected before China can have its territorial integrity.
Is it not well within the power of the Communist Party to change that attitude of 1.3 billion people because of their influence over the cultural perspective of the man on the streets, so to speak?
It might be, but there's no incentive to do so, because I think that having a strong sense of nationalism, inculcating a strong sense of nationalism is one of the ways that they encourage people to identify with and support the rule of the Communist Party, that the party is a defender of the Chinese nation.
And this is exactly the issue in Tibet.
Right. And that having conflict with Taiwan or Japan or the United States, you know, kind of forces people into the arms of the government. But that's not limited to China. This idea of fear-mongering toward outsiders as a way of gathering political support, this happens in other countries too. Now, military balance, here's what worries me. China has developed what they call a carrier killer. It's a missile, very high-speed missile, independently maneuverable, so it can maneuver in flight. And it's considered potentially capable of getting through the thick set of defenses that the U.S. has surrounding its aircraft carriers to actually strike and destroy an aircraft carrier. We've relied upon aircraft carriers to project force into the seas around Taiwan. It's been the threat of, you know, the devastating firepower that carriers possess that has deterred, one of the things that's deterred China from attacking Taiwan. Now, here's the problem, is that the U.S. Navy, these aircraft carriers are quite an investment. They're pretty expensive. We only have 11 of them, more than anybody else, but still. And so the worry is that if China has a weapon that can actually take out an aircraft carrier, then we can't bring that carrier within range of that weapon. Which means that we couldn't close on Taiwan in an emergency and actually defend Taiwan and its waters, you know, on site. So here's how some in the U.S. military think about this. They think that, well, if our ability to gain access to the East China Sea is inhibited by this carrier killer weapon, then we have to have the ability to take out that weapon preemptively before it's used. Which means we also have to get past the the air defenses that China has, which means we have to take out all those air defense sites, which means we also have to destroy their command and control and communications facilities. So then you begin figuring, in order to carry out the core mission, which is to destroy the threat to our carriers, there's a proliferating set of other targets that we end up needing to also deal with. And that means that you couldn't have a war that was limited to Taiwan and the surrounding skies and ocean. You would have to have a preemptive war that would go deep into Chinese territory and would attack some core military assets, which would mean a big war, not a local limited war, but a much bigger war. And it's a preemptive thing. You can't wait. You know, if you have carriers within range, you can't wait, you know, long enough till they actually strike the weapon, you know, launch the weapon. You're under pressure to take that weapon out before it's used. That means you have to be the U.S. would have to be the first to strike. Preempt. Now, of course, if we have, you know, sane and rational and prudent leadership, you know, we don't really have to worry about, you know, the U.S. behaving in, you know, kind of a rash manner. I'll let you finish the thought. So here's Donald Trump. Donald Trump says, I fully understand the One-China policy, but I don't know why we have to be bound by a One-China policy unless we make a deal with China, have to do with other things, including trade. I don't want China dictating to me. Actually, when Donald Trump took the call from the Taiwanese president, people in Taiwan were happy. Oh, this is a sign that the United States, you know, is willing to be closer to Taiwan and support us. You know what the reaction to this is? It's like, wait a minute, what are you saying? Are you saying that you would actually trade off? You would trade Taiwan? You know, you've been kind of implicitly having a security guarantee, and you've been selling us weapons, and you've been refusing to recognize Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan. All of that has been, you know, enough to keep us safe this year. But what are you saying here, that if you get a good trade deal, maybe you would sell out Taiwan?
Follow the money.
Now here's how Beijing reacted. This is an editorial in Global Times. It's a kind of a nationalist newspaper controlled by the party. The One-China policy is not for selling. Trump thinks that everything can be valued, and as long as his leverage is strong enough, he can sell or buy. If a price can be put on the U.S. Constitution, will the American people sell their country's constitution and implement the political systems of Saudi Arabia or Singapore? This is actually kind of interesting because, by the way, last time we met, I kind of said that my interpretation of his comments about Taiwan was that he saw it as a bargaining chip, and then over the weekend he seemed to confirm what I said. So I think so. But what was interesting is that the Chinese have often felt frustrated because American officials want China to buy into certain sets of principles that we subscribe to, right? You know, human rights and democracy and rule of law and a rule-governed international system. And they've often felt frustrated because they felt like, well, we didn't have any say in making those rules. We don't subscribe to those rules and principles. We would rather do business with you. We would rather bargain on the basis of mutual interest, and not feel that you're imposing your principles or standards on us. But they said, you know, when they heard that Donald Trump was going to take power, they said, oh, here's a businessman. He's a deal maker. He's not going to lecture us about democracy or human rights or principles or rules. He's just going to look to make deals, and we can make deals. We're good at that. Now they're actually saying, wait a minute, there's certain principles here. You know, you signed up to, you agreed to certain principles in our relationship, and now you're trying to just make deals, and we don't like that. So it's really funny how their reaction is shifted. We're going to talk about the 9-dash line along the South China Sea. China responded to Trump's comment by flying a nuclear, I don't know if it actually was armed, a nuclear capable bomber along that line. It was a pretty pointed remark. Okay, I'm going to have to go quicker with the South China Sea. South China Sea is 1/3 of all global maritime traffic, 1/2 of global merchant fleet tonnage, $5 trillion worth of goods. It's a crucial maritime sea lane. Strategic for China also because most of its oil comes from the Middle East through those seas. The sea itself has potentially large oil and gas deposits, although we really don't have good estimates because because of the conflicts there, we haven't been able to get in and do the proper seismic studies to tell for sure how much oil and gas there might be. It's had rich fishing grounds, although it's being overfished and those are dwindling somewhat. All right, so Malaysia, the yellow lines here, let's see if I can do this. These yellow lines are Malaysia's maritime claims. It claims that it has control of those waters. This blue line is Vietnam's claims in the South China Sea. That's a lot. That's second only to China. Brunei just claims this little corridor. The Philippines claims, let's see, where I'm having trouble locating that. I think it's this purple line. That's the Philippines. And then, I said Vietnam. And then China claims everything within this cow's tongue. It's a 9-dash line. And Taiwan claims all the same territory. And actually, it was the nationalist government in Taiwan that first drew a 9-dash line that follows this line. They first drew it in 1947. So Communist China is just taking the map that they drew and saying, yeah, that's all ours. And when I was teaching in China in '96, I showed a map like this and showed China's claims. It goes right up to shorelines practically of these neighboring countries, and everything is Chinese. And I showed it and I kind of laughed, and my students got so angry at me for laughing at China's claims because I thought they were kind of on their face, it kind of looks ridiculous. No, of course that's China. What are you talking about? Get out of here. Now there are two groups of islands, the Paracels and the larger group of stratas. When I say islands, that's really misleading because some of them are just shoals. They're like sandbars that are underwater at high tide, or they're like rocks that are underwater at high tide, or even rocks that are just a little bit above water at high tide. I'll come back to a little bit later a little more about that. But, all these countries have actually they've occupied these features, let's call them features since they're not all actual islands. They've occupied these features, and you can see China is the dark red, and then Vietnam is the purple, and the Philippines is this color, etc. Now, so there's military forces throughout here. A lot of countries have taken like a reef and, build it up, they dredged, sand and build a little artificial island. And then they actually build like platforms on the island and stuff like that. So there's no real island there, but then they make an island, an artificial island. Now let me show you what this looks like. This is China's base building. So this shows before. This is what it looked like before. It's basically a coral reef, an atoll. I think it's that color because it's actually underwater. And then this is what it looks like after they've dredged and built it up. Same thing here. They build it up. So this is what they're doing, and they're not the only country doing this, but they've done it on a vaster scale and at a very rapid pace in recent years. And some of these are so massive now that they actually have runways and they're capable of landing military planes. Now, the Law of the Seas Treaty is applicable to the conflicts in the South China Sea. Most countries have signed it, have ratified it. The U.S. has not. We signed, but we never ratified because our Congress doesn't ratify anything. The last time we ratified a major multilateral treaty was 1997. So we just don't do that. And we have said that we will respect the treaty and uphold its terms. Now, the treaty says nothing about the territorial claims. Who owns the islands? Nobody, there's no international law that actually clarifies that very much. And, in fact, point of fact, these are all historically uninhabited islands. So there's no history of people living on these islands. In fact, they were, you can see this, these seas border on all these countries. People from each of these societies, by people I mean fishermen, move through this area, fishing, trade, stopping on islands, during storms and things like that. So these islands, to the extent that were actually used by all the surrounding peoples. There were no, so from my perspective, what I've read, none of the countries have very good territorial claims, but that doesn't stop them from making them. Now, what this Law of the Seas does is that it states the conditions under which countries can make territorial claims, claims to territorial waters and exclusive economic zones. Now, territorial waters are from your coastline, or if it's an island from the island's perimeter. A country can claim 12 miles in territorial waters, which means it has control over those waters. Now, there is something called right of innocent passage, where military vessels of other countries can pass through these waters, but they have to, we'll just use the term, put their weapons down. They have to kind of turn off their radar and they have to kind of put their weapons in a passive position. And then they can pass through it. To get from one ocean to the next, you sometimes have to go through territorial waters. Now, China claims that countries also need to give prior notification before passing through territorial waters. The U.S. and most other countries say that that's not a requirement. It's a conflict over how to interpret the Law of the Seas language. Now, so that's one disagreement. The other is that countries can claim exclusive economic zones extending up to 200 nautical miles. This gives them not rights to the surface, but rights to the fish and the minerals and resources underneath the ocean, in the waters and in the seabed. Now, in order to generate claims to territorial waters, a feature has to be above water at high tide, and it has to, the country has to be able to prove that it's its territory. But in order to generate a 200-mile exclusive economic zone, which will give you rights to drill for oil and fish and mineral, it has to be a habitable island. So that means, for instance, it has to have some water source. Unless it is habitable, then you cannot claim an EEZ rather. You might be able to claim a territorial waters, but not EEZ. Now, for an EEZ, U.S. and most other countries claim that military passage is permitted. China also allows for military passage, but it claims that the right of innocent passage rules apply, which means that the weapons have to be down and there has to be prior notification according to that. The U.S. says that with an EEZ, that's not required. You can pass through with your weapons up and prepared for war, and you can also, you don't need to give prior notification. So the U.S. has a strong interest in protecting freedom of navigation for both commercial and military vessels through the South China Sea. And it's worried that if China makes extravagant claims to about 90% of that sea, that it will try to place limits on the freedom of U.S. military vessels to pass through that area. So this is both a conflict about what, where does China have the right to claim an EEZ, but also what are the restrictions on military passage through EEZs. Now, when the U.S. passed through China's EEZ with their weapons on and no notification, they are challenging China's interpretation of the law of the sea. And China very much resents that and has said that it will, over time, more and more resist it. When the U.S. military ships pass through the 12-mile territorial zone around China's claim features with their weapons on, what they're doing is saying, we don't recognize your territorial claim. Because if we did recognize China's territorial claim, we would have to concede that they have that's necessary for us to put our weapons off in order to pass through that territory, innocent passage. And we're purposely not abiding by those rules so we can challenge China's claim. Yeah.
So when the Chinese build those bases that you just showed us, are they trying to suggest that there's 200-mile zones around those bases?
Yes, they are claiming that those are islands and that they generate territorial and EEZ claims. And the U.S. and most other countries say, no, that's not true. Now, the Philippines took their claims to the Permanent Court of Arbitration because they've had a number of run-ins with China over the years. And they looked only at the Spratlys because that's the only place where, the Philippines does not claim the Paracels. Vietnam does. Philippines does. And what the Permanent Court of Arbitration said, interestingly, is that none of these features are actually islands capable of supporting habitation. So whoever owns these islands, none of them generate an EEZ claim. Some of them, those that are below water, they don't generate any territorial claims either. There are some features above water but are not habitable. And so there are some islands that people can, whoever owns them can generate a 12-mile territorial claim. But basically, it undercut China's claims because most of this territory is actually within the Philippines EEZ. And so actually it means that China has no right to drill there or to fish there. Now China angrily rejected the ruling. It hinted at it was going to create an air defense identification zone. This is a zone that many countries use. It actually it's not defined in international law. There's no treaty that says what it is or whether it's okay. The Chinese declared an air defense identification zone off of in the seas surrounding the islands in disputes with Japan in the East China Sea. Now they're threatening to do the same in the South China Sea. That would mean that they would claim that countries would have to give prior notification before any commercial or military planes flew through the area. So they're kind of trying to control the airspace as well as the water. The U.S. has said it will not does not recognize the East China Sea air defense zone and doesn't give any notification, and it will not do so in the South China Sea. The Philippines accepts the ruling, of course, which is in its own favor, but it's instead of pressing its victory, this new president, Duterte, who's had big conflicts with the Obama administration, has sought to avoid conflict with China. He went to Beijing. He agreed to joint development projects in these waters. China promised the Philippines $15 billion investment. Duterte canceled some military drills with the U.S. and is threatening to kick us off some bases. So the very country that successfully challenged China in arbitration now is kind of going the other direction. The U.S. has, of course, welcomed the ruling. They've been sending naval vessels within 12 miles of Chinese created artificial islands to make the point that they're not legitimate. Now, there are some cooperative efforts to diffuse tensions. In August, ASEAN and China agreed to a maritime emergency hotline. They agreed to apply a code of unplanned encounters at sea to the South China Sea. And they're working on a framework for a code of conduct. The problem with it is that there was a previous code of conduct that China's not, and other countries have not really respected. So that's where things stand on those two conflicts. They both are, at this point, have in recent times been kind of becoming more tense. And over time, military dynamics are playing a bigger role because the balance of power is shifting in China's direction, and that's emboldening the Chinese. So that's the hot spots. Let me see. Make sure we have some time to. Yeah, we have about 15 minutes. Yes, ma'am.
Where they built these new features with country and radar and communications equipment, are they staff or military personnel, or is it just out there with individuals who need to use it? But
they are. Now, China did make it. Yeah, she's asking, are these bases staffed by military? And they are, although China's trying to make claims that they're about like, hurricane detection or something like that, and China did a few years ago create a kind of, they basically turned over some of the patrolling they do in the South China Sea away from the military vessels to something like a Coast Guard. And the idea there was that maybe if there is a kind of violent encounter, maybe a Coast Guard encounter with the Chinese Coast Guard would not be as threatening as one with the military ship. However, I think in recent times, China's, with the base building, that China's military is taking a bigger role. Yes?
If Trump escalates his rhetoric, maybe tries to implement a little twist or two that China's not malleable to before, what is the likely course of that kind of confrontation. In other words, I may not be phrasing it correctly, but where does it go from there? Let's put it that way.
Well, I think that there's there's an escalatory ladder, and China won't jump to the top of the ladder initially, right? It'll be gradual. Depends a little bit on what the U.S. provocation is, but there's such wide-ranging cooperation between U.S. and China. People don't realize with all the conflict, there's just so much going on. They could cut off educational exchanges, cultural exchanges. They could cut off, cooperation on scientific cooperation and cooperative efforts on climate change. They could reduce the size of their embassy, or they could, ask the U.S. to close consulates, or they could increase pressure on the American press that works in China, and they've actually in the past kicked out New York Times reporters and things like that. They could do more of that. They could, they could deny investment permits to American businesses. There's all kinds of things that they could do, right? They could give orders to Airbus instead of Boeing. So there would be a series of things like that before you got into serious military kinds of clashes. I think China's leaders are they're rational, and they carefully weigh risks. It's not North Korea, where you worry about the rationality of your opponent. Yes.
And so oddly enough, does in the Trump scenario, God help us, does China become the stable partner and oddly enough the reassuring response to Trump's ideas?
What's kind of interesting is that China, so we're going to reject the TPP, right? China stepped right up, as I mentioned last time, with this alternative trade agreement. And, so now they're the defenders of an open world economy. The U.S. has said, our next president said he doesn't believe in climate change. Humans don't have anything to do with it, or not enough that we have to respond. Well, China, said we'll take leadership in climate change because China believes that moving away from coal is necessary because of pollution and because the public won't take any more of it. That once that people become economically secure, it's like Maslow's hierarchy. They're not just worried about survival. Now they want quality of life, and they don't want to raise their kids in this terrible pollution. So the pressures on the government to take action anyway. Plus, they say, hey, we're creating whole new industries, and we will become the supplier to the world of all these technologies, and finally that climate change would hurt us. China would be one of the worst hit areas. So they're saying, we'll take leadership on this one. The U.S. doesn't want to lead, we'll lead. And then last year, they made a huge commitment to, they're already one of the biggest, I think maybe the biggest contributor of troops to UN peacekeeping. And now they've made a huge commitment of money to fund peacekeeping projects. That's so China's saying on more and more issues, they're saying the kinds of things the U.S. used to be known for, the kinds of leadership we used to provide in global public goods, China's saying, we'll step forward and do it. And then we'll get kind of much more credit, legitimacy, and influence from that.
Well, business is a broad word that covers a lot of things. And it's like hedge funds. They're retailers. They're marketing stuff. But the basis of American business is design and engineering, and that includes agriculture. And I cannot believe that American business is going to sit back and let this stuff go on. I just can't believe it. Because it's not a climate in which you can rationally design products and processes that improve people's lives.
See, this is one of the problems though with China is that I think our exports to China are about $120 billion a year. That's a lot, but China, we import, I think, $440 billion a year. So there's a lot more firms that might see China as competitors than those who see it as a. We don't have a lot of things that China wants to buy, and agriculture is one of the areas we do. You know, planes are another. Yeah, I don't know. You know, even the businesses that invest and profit from China, they're worried about intellectual property rights. China's been favoring its state-owned firms more lately, which hurts international business. I don't know. And also that, you know, remember that there's different kinds of business and they don't always agree. Like right now, it looks like oil and gas is going to be, you know, hugely influential in this administration. The Secretary of State is, my God, he's the former CEO of Exxon. You know? And then is it the EPA yet? Who's like a climate change denier? What?
He has sued the EPA.
He sued the EPA.
To reduce regulations.
Right.
And he's in charge.
I think the major qualification for a cabinet posting in this administration appears to be that you have called for the elimination of the agency that you're going to be asked to. That's the major qualification. It's an odd way of conducting. Yeah.
You referred to some Aboriginal people in Taiwan. Is there a baseline of racism between Taiwan and China? That's a pretty radical question, but that may define the historical resistance here that we've been talking about. All people aren't the same over there. I mean, that's a simple way of saying it, but I know the Philippine people are significantly viewed internally as different from the Chinese. We have that issue here also.
So I don't claim to have any deep knowledge of this. All I know is that it is true that the Aboriginal peoples in Taiwan, historically, especially since '49, they've been you know, mostly at the bottom of the economic, social, political ladder. I think they've improved, their status has improved in recent decades. But yeah, I think there's a degree of that. Yes?
Has the U.S. challenged only the artificial islands in terms of China's territorial claims, or have we ever challenged the mainland territorial claims of China?
Well, first of all, within the South China Sea, we say that artificial islands are not islands, they're not territory. And we've said that no nation should build artificial islands, or certainly should not make claims based on it. As far as all the other land claims to islands or features, we say we have no position on that. We don't claim to know who these belong to, but we want these claims to be adjudicated peacefully through negotiation. As far as the mainland itself, no, we accept that all Chinese current territorial claims, including in Tibet and Xinjiang, where there are groups that are unhappy under Chinese rule, but we don't challenge China's right to rule over those areas. We do ask them to, I mean, we complain when they commit what we consider human rights abuses.
There are alternatives to TPP, which you talked about last week.
Yes.
Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership.
Right.
Are we excluded because they didn't want us? Are we excluded because we didn't want to be in it because we were going to use the other thing? Is there a possibility that we could be included in that? So that's kind of 3 questions.
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, I'm not sure I know the answer. I think probably it was, I believe, initiated by China, and I'm not sure how it was determined who would be invited to join or what the criteria would be. My guess is that the U.S. Did not want to join because we saw it as a competitor with TPP, and also we wanted to control whatever groups were part of it. The Chinese created something called the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And the U.S. saw it as a competitor to the World Bank, which we control, and to the Asian Development Bank, which Japan controls. And so we said, we don't like it, and we don't want any of our, we're not going to join, and we don't want any of our allies to join. It ends up that all our allies joined anyway. Some European countries joined, Australia, South Korea, I think. No, Japan did not join. But a bunch of U.S. allies actually did join, including Great Britain. And the U.S. was kind of embarrassed because we were left. We thought that, well, if the U.S. says nobody should join, then nobody will join, and the Chinese will be embarrassed. They'll be left with a little handful of, small countries that no one cares about. Instead, other countries said, no, we think there's a good need for infrastructure investment in Asia, and China's willing to step forward, we're willing to help, and we'll all do it together. And also other countries said, if you're worried about what standards China will use, well, it makes sense to join and then actually have some influence over those standards instead of just criticizing from the outside. So the U.S. has kind of backed off. We no longer tell countries not to join, but we're not willing to join ourselves. Maybe one more question? Quickly. All right, so Thursday we're going to kind of wrap up, and we're going to do big picture, and we're going to look at what some of the major theoretical perspectives tell us about the prospects for peace between the U.S. and China in the future. Thanks.